my talk is split up into 3 parts. At first, I want to describe what Replicant is about. It's like sort of Android, but what is it exactly? And what is the Goldelico version of it? So the project I am working on. In the second part, I'd like to present the status of the current project, like which features are already supported on the GTA04. And in the last part, I'd like to give a short introduction into how to develop for Replicant. Like a few easy steps how you could compile it yourself and experiment with it. So there's a site from the Replicant project website which describes Replicant, and I'd like to read it. Replicant is a fully free Android distribution running on several devices, putting the emphasis on freedom and privacy. So now we know Replicant is some sort of Android, and also Android is promoted to be an open source project. It seems it's not like fully open source, so that's why there's Replicant. They take the Android source code and try to make it 100% open source software. In addition to this, the Replicant project also provides an app store which contains only free software apps. Because the Google Play Store, for example, is proprietary software, and you are not allowed to use it on any device you like. So they introduced the F-Droid App Store, which contains several hundred or even 1,000 applications for your smartphone, and they are all free and open source software. The next thing they do is they remove all the non-free blobs. There are a lot of Android phones out there, but a lot of them need proprietary drivers, for example, or firmware in order to function. So the Replicant project tries to remove all those parts which are non-free to reach a 100% open source smartphone. The problem with that is that they have to do a lot of anti-vendor pods, because the vendors like Samsung, for example, they don't like to open source their drivers in some cases. So the Replicant developers have to somehow work around this. So they have, for example, they can't use graphics acceleration because there's no free driver for it, and they have to use the fallback for software rendering, which is done on the CPU. Or they have to remove the Wi-Fi functionality because it needs a non-free Wi-Fi firmware. And yes, this is really hard for them because the vendors don't support them. And the project, or the idea with the GTA04 is that we are a vendor who likes to have Replicant on the phone, and we like to support the project. And so the GTA04 in that regard is a little special because we try to cooperate with the Replicant project and together try to reach the best support for the device, for the GTA04. Now this is a little graphic about the inheritance, the Android inheritance. It all starts at the top with the Android open source project, which is run by Google and contains all the new versions, for example, of Android, and like the new version 5.0, which was released recently. It's first released as the Android open source project, but the Android open source project only contains the free parts of Android. So, for example, the Gmail or the Google Play Store, etc., they are not included. And also the Android open source project only is available for the Nexus devices, for the Google, like the devices from Google. And even they are not fully supported because the non-free drivers are not included. So all in all, the Android open source project is nice to have and to look into the source code, but you cannot just compile it and put it on your phone because it doesn't support a lot of different types of hardware. Then there is the CyanogenMod Android distribution, which you probably have heard of already. CyanogenMod, they grab the source code from the Android open source project and try to add as many drivers as possible. They have, I think, a bunch of 40 to 50 devices from the big vendors, from Samsung, from HTC, and they take the kernels which are released by the vendors and put them all together into one project. And they also take the non-free drivers which were released. They include the Wi-Fi binaries and the graphics binaries, because they want to, their aim basically is to support lots of hardware with their Android version. So now we have a more or less open source project, Android project, which supports quite some hardware. The next step is the Replicant distribution. It takes the source code from CyanogenMod and selects, they have, I think, 4 or 5 devices only. They select the best devices which are usable with the least non-free software. And they select those devices and try to free them, to remove all the binary drivers and the binary firmware. And they also, for example, one step they do is to remove the graphics driver and implement the software rendering mechanism. And this is what Replicant then provides. It's only for very few devices, but it's a working distribution where if you have a supported phone, you can flash it to your device and use a free software Android. Now the Goldelico version, we take most of the sources of the Replicant project, but we add some of our own repositories in order to add the parts which are needed to make it run on the GTA04. So, for example, the kernel, we have our own repository for our kernel, and we include all the drivers and adopt the drivers to the Android system in order to make it run, in order to make Android or Replicant run on the GTA04. So we, at this stage, we do not yet upstream a lot of changes to the Replicant project, but there is some cooperation, like, yeah, we will come to this later. There's another slide for it. So, okay, this is the rough inheritance of the Android open source code. Now, what is special about the Goldelico Replicant version? The Goldelico Replicant version was started because there was no official support for the GTA04 in Replicant at that time. In the meanwhile, the Replicant project officially started to support the GTA04. And so now we have this sort of cooperation, like the Replicant project develops some features, and the Goldelico version also gets some features, and then we can copy or exchange the different versions, and we then both have all the features. But there are some features which are unique to one of the systems, because there are some, yes, like for example, the first point here, the single partition image. We, as the GTA04 project, we'd like to have one single tarball, which can just be extracted to a partition of your SD card, and then you can put it in the GTA04 and boot from that partition. And then the system starts. And the Replicant project uses the Android way of doing it. So you need a different bootloader, you need a kernel with the initial run disk, and you need a root file system image. So you have like 3 images, and you need a special partitioning scheme on your SD card. And then, so this is the Android way, and they want to keep the Android way, and we, as the GTA04 project, we'd like to do it the same way as the other distributions, like the Debian project or the CubeMoko project do it. Because this also supports our multi-boot system, where you have for example, 4 partitions on your SD card, and then you can put 4 different operating systems on each of them, or on every single one of them. And then you can boot partition 1 on operating system 1, for example, Replicant, and you can put CubeMoko on partition 2, and you can put SHR on partition 3, and you can dual boot or quad boot them. Yeah. Another thing which we currently do different is we include the only non-free blob which is included in the Goldelico version of Replicant is that we include the non-free Wi-Fi firmware, because we want to, right now at least, we want to make it usable out of the box. So you just extract the tarball on your SD card and put it in the phone, and then you can start it, you can use Wi-Fi, you can do phone calls. And in the Replicant project wants to keep all of this out. And if you decide that you want, with the upstream Replicant project, if you decide that you want to use Wi-Fi, you have to install the Wi-Fi firmware yourself. And the biggest change basically is that another important point is that we have the universal kernel, which is based on the version 3.12 kernel from the GTA04 project, which was presented before. And the nice thing about this kernel is that it supports a lot of different devices from this community. So it runs on the normal GTA04 board. As you can see in the picture at the bottom, I was even able to put Angry Birds on it and run it, but to be honest, it was very slow because there's no hyper acceleration for the graphics. So it was not really usable, but it did start and you could see the things moving. Then we support the Netux 7004 tablet, which you can see at the top. And the nice thing is that it's the very same image in the very same kernel. So you can install it on one SD card, you can put it in the GTA04 and you boot, and you have an Android. And then you can take the SD card out and put it in the tablet, and you can start it without any modifications or changes. It will boot to the Replicant system on the tablet. So it can run the same kernel and will detect the small differences and adapt to it. And of course, for the future, as you heard, there's work to support the Neo 900 and the Pyra in the GTA04 kernel. And once those support is in the kernel, we can upgrade to a newer kernel which contains this support. So it won't work with 3.12, but then we can maybe jump to 3.19 or something. And then the same system will also run on the Neo 900 and on the Pyra with very few work. I mean, of course, there are some adoptions which need to be integrated into the system, but it will be much less work to get it up and running than it was to get it up and running on the GTA04, where we started from basically from zero. Okay, so what is the current status of the project? The first step which we worked on was, of course, to get root access for the developers. So you can just plug in the USB cable to your phone, and then you can use the Android debug bridge, the ADB tool, to you type ADB shell, and then you have a root jar on your smartphone, and you can do everything which you like. The next thing is that we support some of the sensors, not yet all of them, but there's some library which does the sensor support, and I've worked on that one and integrated the support for the accelerometer. And on this device, for example, there's an ambient light sensor. This is also supported, so the device can automatically adopt the brightness of the display to the ambient light. Then we have GPS and Wi-Fi working. You can Like you can use it for a navigation system, for example, and you can use it to surf the web via Wi-Fi. But of course, for this, you need the non-free firmware block for Wi-Fi. But we, in the Goldelico variant, we have this block integrated. So you can just unpack, start it, and use Wi-Fi. And the big changes I did recently is I was working on the radio interface layer, which is the component of the system which talks to the modem. And we have now support to send and receive SMS messages, to send and receive voice calls, to send USSD commands, for example, to check your balance of your prepaid card. And we have support for 3G mobile data, so you can connect to the internet on the go and surf the web. But of course, there's also still some work to do.
Does 3G data mean that only UMTS is supported, or up to?
Up to.
Up to.
Yes.
GPRS also?
Yes, okay. Depending on the coverage of data. Right. Okay, so the next, or the big milestone which we still have to reach is power management. This is also a lot of work in the kernel, I think. Because, for example, the Wi-Fi driver does not yet do any power management. So it always uses a lot of power as soon as you enable Wi-Fi. And it will drain the battery very fast. And there are other spots in the kernel where the drivers can be improved in regard to power management. So this is one big step. To make it really usable as a daily phone, you want to reach like 2 or 3 days of, maybe 2 days of usage. And we have to work on that one. The other thing is radio interface layer improvements. What I said here is we have the basic functionality. You can do all of this. I did all of this. But it does not work in all situations. Like there are some special cases where it doesn't work and we have to fix some bugs to make it really reliable. And yeah, another thing is Bluetooth. We do not yet support Bluetooth because it's also a problem with the kernel driver at the moment. It is, yeah, for a moment we have Bluetooth disabled completely in the kernel because it doesn't work. And even once we have the Bluetooth kernel driver ready, there's the Bluetooth stack on Android is a little complex, and it did change. They replaced it basically with a new stack in the new version. So we have to decide if we want to stick to the old one or directly go to the new stack. And it's quite some work. Then, of course, we have more sensors to support. The GTA04 has really a bunch of sensors. And as you can see, only a few of them are working, and we have to integrate the other ones. And the last point is the hardware voice routing functionality. Like, this is used for voice calls. Right now, the voice calls used, they route the voice from the modem through the CPU to the codec or to the speaker. And this is, yeah, it is not optimal because it uses more power than you. There's also a hardware option where you can directly connect the modem to the speaker, basically. And then the CPU can go to sleep while during a phone call. So this is supported by GTA04 and newer versions. And the software routing, which is right now implemented, is also supported by the older GTA04 A3 variant. So, but as I do only have the A3, I implemented software routing for now, and at some point we can integrate the hardware routing to have better quality and better battery usage. Yeah, maybe to conclude, it's right now all of the basic functionality which is needed in a phone is there. You can test it and you can play around with it, but it's more like a beta software and not yet really usable as a daily phone because it's not reliable enough. But I'd like to encourage everyone to download the images we provide or compile a version themselves and just play around with it, test it, and report bugs so we can fix them. Okay, this is more or less a little bit of history and some of the big milestones which were achieved in this project. In the very beginnings of the GTA04, there was the upstream Replicant project. They ported the Android version 2.3 to the GTA04, and they showed that basic functionality was there. It was a very old version of Android, but it was maybe 2 to 3 years ago when this version was released. And yeah, you could boot it, and I think you could connect to the internet and surf, but I think phone calls were not really working. Yeah, and at some point, when the new Android open source project releases, like 4.0, for example, were released, they tried to port the new Android project needed a newer kernel. And the Replicant developers tried to somehow use the 3.0 kernel to port the Android kernel and integrate all the drivers needed for the GTA04, but they failed. It was very hard, and at some point they were so disappointed that they dropped the support for GTA04, and so the GTA04 wasn't supported by the Replicant project anymore. Then we as a community, we still wanted to have Replicant or Android on our phones. So we started the other way around. We didn't take the Android kernel and try to integrate all the stuff needed for GTA04, but we took the GTA04 kernel version 3.12 and tried to integrate all the stuff which is especially needed for Android. For example, the Android debug bridge driver, which is one of the most important drivers that you can connect to your phone and that you can have a shell and do the development. Then making the suspend work was really hard because there were some race conditions in the kernel drivers where the phone would go to suspend and directly resume again, or sometimes it would go to suspend and you weren't able to resume at all because it didn't recognize the push of the button. And then there's this special functionality, the wake locks, which is only available in the Android kernels. This is a mechanism which is which is meant to improve the battery lifetime of your devices, because it will each application, for example, you are running on your device needs to grab a wake lock, and as long as there is some active, this shows that there is an active application, and the phone has to stay on. And as soon as there's no wake lock hold anymore, the phone will automatically go to suspend and will save battery. So we implemented that one as well. And at that stage, we already had a pretty good kernel, which was able to run the Android system. And having this kernel, we were able to reconvince, this was at the time of Replicant 4.0 or Android 4.0. And so we had the first Goldelico version of Replicant available. That's 4.0. This was tech preview, you can say, where just the kernel was working and the system was booting. But as we could show that it is now running and we have a working kernel, we could reconvince the upstream developers to officially start working on the GTA04 again. So with the Replicant version 4.2, which is the latest version available right now, there is official support from the upstream project for our smartphone again. Now, some of the milestones we reached in our Goldelico version of the Replicant is, for example, the voice routing, so that you can do a phone call where the voice is working. You could dial and get through before, but you couldn't hear anything or say anything. So this is rather useless. And we implemented the voice routing, so now you can really do a phone call. We integrated the sensors, and of course we also have the universal image which makes installation and multi-booting very easy on the GTA04. And the upstream project worked in parallel on their separate version of Replicant. And for example, they implemented the GPS, which I later integrated in our version, so we can also use it. They implemented the headset detection so that you can plug in your headset and it will automatically switch to the headset instead of the earpiece, for example. And what they also have is encryption. We don't have encryption, and this is related to the single partition image. For encryption, you need an initial RAM disk, and this is only available in the if you use the Android way of booting the system, because the encryption needs to be initialized before the root file system is started. And as we have everything all in one, there is right now no encryption possible. Maybe in the future we can try to implement some sort of container which contains the file system and have it encrypted, but there we have to have a closer look on it. So this is one thing which is right now only available in the upstream project, and the other things are available in our version at least. It's like the voice routing, for example, was not yet integrated in upstream, but it's available. We release everything, and once the upstream developer decides that they want to use our code, they can of course take it, and at some point we might also clean it up and send it upstream ourselves.
Is the encryption software only, or does the GTA04 has a AES?
As far as I know, the Honor processor basically supports encryption in hardware, but I think it's not used in this Android.
I think it's not supported by the kernel.
Yeah, so it's done in software, even so it might be possible to do it in hardware. Okay, and now a short look at the kernel. The 3.12 Replicant kernel is based upon the 3.12 GTA04 kernel, but as I mentioned before, I needed to integrate some special drivers which are needed for Android and do some changes. But recently I cleaned it up a little bit and I sorted all the patches and I did a little statistics, and as you can see, there is only 75 patches which are on top of the GTA04 kernel needed to implement all the Android functionality, or the functionality which is needed by Android. So I think this is pretty nice, and I think it should be not that hard to go to a new kernel, because it's only 75 patches. And once we rebase this on a newer version of the GTA04 kernel, it's not so much work to adopt those patches. And as you can see, like the 75 patches, 30 of them, which is almost half of it, is from the Android debug bridge driver. It's very huge. And once you get this one working, it's only very few patches left. And 9 patches are only configuration options which need to be enabled. So those are, no work basically. 7 patches are for OTG wake lock, so that the system stays on when you have USB peripherals attached to it. Yeah, so, and then there are some smaller patches which are only one patch for one driver where a little change was needed, for example. So I think this is very nice, and at some point we might upgrade to a newer kernel and have the support for Neo 900, for Pyra, and for the device tree in general. So once you compile a device tree for a different device which might not yet be supported, you can just include the device tree of that, and maybe it will already boot. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, there's Bluetooth and power management is still pretty much missing in the kernel. So those are the 2 big parts we have to work on. Now I'd like to give a short introduction in how to develop for this project, or for Android or Replicant. The Goldelico version, the replicant toolchain is structured as in XML file, which is called the manifest, and it contains all the repositories which are needed in order to compile a full Android version. This contains the kernel, the drivers, the apps which are pre-installed, the system, the sound system, the graphic system, everything's included. And it's at the beginning you download this small XML file, and then there's a special tool called repo, and this tool will then look into the XML file and download all the repositories which are needed. This also contains, for example, the cross-compiler toolchains which are needed to compile all the code. And yes, it will download all the files which are needed. This is like 30 gigabytes of data, and it's a little flocky to get it working, because maybe you have to try several times because something wasn't downloaded correctly. But once you have downloaded it, then it's actually very convenient to work with it. So we have like a little bit modified version of this manifest, which points to the repositories we have created for the GTA04 support. So if you go to this link, there's step-by-step instructions how to download and set up everything you need to compile your own version of Replicant for the GTA04. This will then also contain the Goldelico overlay, which contains all the GTA04 features and drivers, etc. Then once you have downloaded all of this, you have a folder with lots of subfolders inside, and at the first look you might be confused because you don't know where to look. And so there's just very few important folders. For the GTA04, for example, we have the folder device/Goldelico/GTA04. This is the most important folder because everything which is needed to support the GTA04, all the hardware abstraction layers, the modem abstraction layer, all the configuration, which drivers to use, etc., is in that directory. And you can just browse in there and have a look and look at the make files to see which modules are built in there, and have a look at the configuration files, for example. Then there is the kernel/Goldelico/GTA04 repository, which is just a clone of the replicant kernel we provide in our Git repository. And this is compiled in order to make it run. And it contains all the replicant patches which I talked before. Then we have this new folder which isn't available in the normal Android toolchain. This is the Goldelico folder, and this just contains some helper scripts which you can use. For example, there's a script which can compile the whole system for you. You just have to execute it. And there is a script which will create a tarball. Once you have compiled the whole system, you can execute the script, and it will copy the kernel and the root file system and everything which is needed from the different directories, put it into one folder, and then create a tarball out of it. So once this script is run, you just have one file which you can then install on your GTA04. And the last important folder is the out folder. This is where all the binaries which were compiled will be put into. So when you compile one module or the whole system, it will be in this folder. You can find the files there, the results. Now that we have an overview of the file structure, I'd like to say a few words about how you can now get your hands dirty and start developing. Each folder which contains code will usually contain an android.mk makefile. And in general, the Android toolchain is built up as one big make project. So there's one makefile in the root directory. And then this makefile will include all the android.mk files from off the subdirectories. And if you take a look at one of the android.mk files, you will usually find a local module variable. And this is set to some name. For example, the modem abstraction library is called HeySrill, and then it will have local module equals HeySrill. And then you, for example, if you want to clean, if you did some tests, you change the code and then you compiled it using MMM, and then you can just specify the path of where the source is located. It will then automatically check which module is in there and compile it. And if you want to clean it, you can make clean and then the name of the module. That's why you need to look it up before. So you go to, for example, you go into the GTA04 device directory from the slide before, and you look at one of the modules, you go inside, you change some code, and then you can do MMM and specify the path to that file or the folder the file is contained in. And then the toolchain will compile everything, like all the dependencies and everything which is needed. And put the binaries into the out folder. And maybe if something went wrong, you want to make clean to remove all the stuff again and start over. Then you can fix your bug, compile again with MMM, and then maybe it's working. Once you have successfully compiled one of the modules, you can then use the ADB tool, which, for example, is in Debian, is available in the package Android Tools ADB. You can just install it. Then you can connect your PC and your phone with a USB cable, and it will automatically detect it. And then you can just issue the ADB push command. You specify the path to the binary which you just built, and the path where it should be put on the system, on the smartphone. And then it will copy, for example, here in this example, we have a library, libx, which is located in the out directory. And it will copy this library over to system lib and libx.so on the device. Then now you have to replace the code on the device. You change it. Then you can issue ADB shell and connect and get a shell access to your smartphone. And then you can, for example, kill the service which you just changed, so it is restarted and the new code is loaded. And then you can, in another terminal, issue ADB logcat. This is the logging system of Android, where all the log messages are printed out to some special location, and you can read that location with the logcat command. So maybe you add some log command in the code, and then you can ADB logcat and grab for what you are looking, like for the message you were putting into the code, and then you can see if it worked or if it didn't work. And so this is basically the step. Once you have the toolchain set up, you just can compile the module, push it to your device, restart the service in a shell, and see what the log is and test it. And it's actually very easy to use and very nice once it's the big system is working. Okay, that's it. I'd like to mention that my work on this project is sponsored by Goldelico Computers, and I'd like to say thank you for it. And yeah, that's it. If you have some questions.
I'm from Nokia N100 to an Android device, and I have issues with the drivers which don't work nicely. So I have to say that overall, the usernet and the kernel Android sucks because it's hard to compile your GNU software on it. It's strict POSIX compliant. So it's rather a personal question than a technical one. Why would you like to fork Android?
How do you mean?
There are so many operating systems around which are partially ported to hardware
Mhm.
And right now you're trying to port Android.
Yes.
It's a mixture of a Linux kernel. So what is your motivation to?
The motivation is that lots of people ask for it because they are familiar with the Android system, and if they switch to, like, they want to keep the same experience. They come maybe from a Samsung device and now they want to have a free phone, but they don't want to switch to some different operating system, which is maybe not so polished or it's not so, they are not so familiar with. And I think another big point is that the Replicant system has this app store available, and there are apps for lots of different things, and like hundreds of apps which you can make use of. And the most of the smaller distributions, at least from the OpenMoko times SHR or CubeMoko, they don't have that big catalog of software available. So the users want to have the apps.
Java suffers the same issue, so they decided to create an emulator app that runs an Android virtual machine to be able to execute Android applications.
Yes, that is possible, and I think it's done on very few devices. I think BlackBerry does it,
Yes.
and I think the Yola does it as well. But for that to work, I think it's quite similar to port the system as a whole, instead of just, if you create an emulator, you have basically to do the same work.
Yeah.
So we can then just run it, and maybe once Yola open sources this code, we can just use it and maybe use it in the other systems. There was another question?
Just that F-Droid is the argument, is the main point, I guess.
Yes, I think it's one of them, like the most important point, because the apps are available.
I can use F-Droid everywhere.
Yes, that's very nice.
Is the F-Droid software itself open source?
Yes.
Can anybody do its own shop?
Yes. Any more questions?
It's basically Android without Google.
It's Android without Google, yes.
When do you plan to do the switch to the latest kernel version? Because he complained that nobody is testing the new kernel.
It depends. Maybe once the newer devices, like the Neo 900 or the Pyra, when they are released, there is more manpower because there are new, like maybe, I think there are like 400 pre-orders for the Neo 900, for example. And maybe 10% of those people are interested in developing for the platform. And maybe once those developers get available and there's more manpower, we can do the switch. Right now, I try to get as feature complete and as stable system with what I have, so we can really make use out of it. And then at some point, we can go to the new kernel once it's needed. Because now the devices are not yet available, so it doesn't make sense to go to the new kernel. Because we have everything we need right now in this kernel, at least pretty much usable. And once the new kernel or the new devices are available, I think it makes sense to go to a newer version. Okay, thank you.